When last we left Germany at the end of World War One, and with the rise of fascism and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, one of the things that I tried to point out was that Germany's terrible financial system and increased instability helped increase the likelihood of a place like of a party like Adolf Hitler's Nazis to rise, and even for the Italians, right? The rise of the fascist party is also directly correlated to the end of World War One and the increased instability that they are experiencing. However, Hitler comes to power officially as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And when that happens, Hitler is able to leverage uh, the sort of dire economics to get himself into a increasingly more powerful political position. Germany is still very weak at that time. Germany could not really fight any real wars or battles. So what happens as a result of this is the there's a couple of different building programs that Hitler does, right? So he starts the Volkswagen company to get people cars. He builds the famous Autobahn. If you have cars, you have to have places to drive them. Also, if you're going to try and conquer Europe, having a way to move your troops via new road systems is very helpful. So throughout the early 1930s, Hitler is on the rise politically, economically. Now he has to start making alliances. So in 1936, he makes the first move to get some soldiers into the Rhineland, which is the area between Germany and France on the western side of Germany, southwestern side of Germany, and on the northeastern side of France. And he also starts to make alliances with um, other fascists. So in 1936, that same year, you also get him having an alliance with Benito Mussolini in what is called the Rome-Berlin Axis, hence why we call them the Axis powers during World War II. But once again, what I hope you see here is that no one is stopping him, right? He is deliberately going against the Treaty of Versailles. Germany cannot, as part of that law, as part of that agreement, cannot have alliances. He cannot begin invading territories. So he is deliberately pushing the buttons here. And then he begins taking more territory. Germany expands further into parts of Austria, and he begins something called the Anschluss, which is the union between Austria and Germany, and ultimately winds up pushing the Germans away. Right, this is part of his plan to develop something called the Lebensraum, living space, right, a place for all Germans, German nationalists, German Aryans to develop and have more territory. But again, no one is stopping him. The reason no one is stopping him is we call this idea of appeasement, Appeasement. Appeasement is the idea that you are going to give in to the wills of an aggressor in order to prevent hostilities. And that's what basically all of Europe is doing. They are letting Hitler continue to expand with the intention that they don't want to continue fighting. They don't want to have another war. We are only, by 1938, we are only, 19 years out of World War One. So we are still recovering. We are afraid to get into another war. As this is continuing and as Hitler is continuing to grow the territory, he moves next into Czechoslovakia. So by 1938, or by early 1938, Hitler has expanded German territories. He's moved into the Rhineland that's 1936. In 1938, he begins to move into Austria. And by the end of 1938, he moves into a territory which is called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was a territory around Czechoslovakia where you have a lot of German-speaking people who live inside of Czechoslovakia. Now, this is kind of tough for us to think about, but in Europe, it is not like where the boundaries end, so too do people who speak those languages or anything like that. In Europe, the borderlands, the areas between countries, right? So the areas between Germany and Czechoslovakia, between Germany and France, they're very squishy areas. people may speak German and live in France. People may speak French and live in Germany. People may speak Czech and live in Germany. People may speak German and live in Czechoslovakia. So it's a very squishy area. And what we see here is Hitler trying to expand his territory to encompass more of those sort of German folks. World War II is this really big push for land, particularly among the Italians and the Germans. They want more and more territory, and that would fit under Hitler's idea of Lebensraum. The same would be true for the Japanese in Asia, but we're not going to focus on that today. Ultimately, more and more territory is gained for the Germans. Ultimately, war begins in September of 1939, and war continues to occur, obviously, for the next 6 years. Hitler winds up invading France with his Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, and by June of 1940, we know that France ultimately has crumbled and has surrendered, and portions of France are controlled. The northern part is occupied by the Germans, and then you have Vichy government down here, which is sometimes called Resistance France. However, it's basically a puppet government of the Nazis. So what you have by 1940 is a territory that looks like this. You have the German Empire fighting to maintain this massive territory here. You have Italy controlling huge portions of southern Italy, southern Europe, Allied countries. You have occupied countries. It is just a tremendous, tremendous land grab by Hitler. Looking towards the end of the war, again, I'm not going to focus on the battles so much, but if we look towards the end of the war, when we get to the ultimate end, we know that the United States, and I'm sure you've encountered this in other parts, well, as we get to the end, Japan is still the last holdout, right? On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders, ending the war in Europe, and then we know that it takes another 3 months for the Japanese to surrender. And the reason is the United States drops 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, respectively. And we could talk about the moral implications of this. We could talk about the military strategic importance of this. What I would argue is that, or can be argued, is that the United States does this in many ways as a sort of flexing to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for much of the end of the war, for the previous couple of years, had been trying to gain more territory and sort of show itself to be a stronger competitor on the global stage. But the United States uses the atomic bombs in many ways, or it can be argued, as I say, to show that you don't want to mess with the United States or else look what will happen. So the United States drops these 2 bombs, and it ultimately forces Japan to surrender. Now, when we talk about the Cold War, I'm going to argue that the Cold War does not begin in 1948, when you have the first inklings of the Berlin Air Crisis. It doesn't begin in 1951, or 1950 to 53, let's say, when you have the Korean crisis. I argue that the Cold War begins earlier than that. The Cold War, in my opinion, begins in February of 1945, where you have the first meeting of what's the world going to look like after World War II. And in this meeting, you have a conversation between Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. At this meeting, the Soviet Union is going to demand, and the other two will ultimately give, into the idea that the Soviet Union should have control over a portion of Germany and Eastern Europe. Now, this may sound like, why would they do that? But the reason is that the Soviet Union had helped defeat Hitler. It is not, it is very well known that if the United States, Britain, France did not have the Soviet Union to assist them, there would have been a much different outcome, or at least a much longer war to fight the Germans and the Italians. That is true. And because the Soviet Union helped them, there was a much needed sort of declaration of assistance there. So because of this, I would argue that the Cold War is beginning here in 1945. Because the Soviet Union has already started making its demands for territory, and the others are have to give it in. So then you have the next meeting, which is in July of 1945. Remember, May 1945, the European war had ended, but the war is still going on in Japan or Asia. Here you have different characters. Churchill had been defeated by Clement Attlee, so Attlee now replaces Churchill, at least at the end of this meeting. Harry Truman had taken over for FDR, who had died in April of 1945, and Stalin's still there, right? The beautiful thing about being a dictator, it can't be replaced. You can die, so anyway. So I always call Yalta Conference is the meeting that Germany would be divided. The Potsdam Conference is the meeting of how Germany would be divided. And this is where they decide that Germany will be broken up into 4 territories. On the western side, the U.S., France, and Britain would get a third of the half. And then on the eastern side, you would get the Soviet control there, and then the Soviet control of Poland and other parts, which will sort of come later. This is where I argue that the Cold War has begun. And then as a result of this, you have in 1948, because Berlin, the capital, is in the eastern side of Germany, what you have is the Berlin airlift, or the Berlin crisis, where you have the Soviet Union locking down different territories or locking down the roads basically to Berlin, so that West Berlin could not be supplied with Western goods, and then the British, French, and Americans basically take airplanes and fly in resources to the people that are in the western side of Berlin. So it's this huge thing, a huge sort of show of force, right? Are you gonna let your people die or starve, or are you gonna help them survive in the West, right? Okay. So the Cold War begins here. In the next portion, we're going to discuss sort of how the Cold War transforms into this, right? So what do I want you to get out of this, right? How does World War II lead to the Cold War? World War II begins as this massive push for land throughout Europe and the Pacific. For the Germans, it's this idea of the Lebensraum. How are we going to get more and more territory? How are we going to get more and more possessions to survive the economic travesties that are occurring here? In Japan, which I haven't necessarily discussed, for the Japanese, it's also part of nationalism. The United States, the European powers can have all of this territory throughout Europe, throughout the world, Africa, and parts of Asia. Why can't an Asian power? Why can't Japan? When the war ends and the Soviet Union is now at the negotiating table with the British, the French, and the Americans, the conversation is still there about territory. And Joseph Stalin will be the person who is going to negotiate more power for the Soviet Union.